Prudence Thorne counted 300 fleeces by candlelight in a dead man's shed. Every buyer in the Dale had already written one word across them. Rotten, she did not argue. She borrowed £4 against her mother's silver, and she carried the key home in her glove. At Skipton, the chief stapler held one up to the light. He held it before the whole floor. £4 for spoilt wool, he said, and a parson's girl to be cheated of it. Buy her a spinning wheel and let her play. 30 men laughed. But Prudence had summered on her uncle's sheep farm. She had read a printed page that 3 larger clothiers had only skimmed. She rubbed a lock between finger and thumb. She was feeling for something none of them had thought to test. If you have ever seen worth in a thing the whole room called rubbish, this story is for you. Before we go on, do one small thing for me. Subscribe to the channel, and in the comments tell me what city you're watching from. I read every one, and I like to know where these stories travel. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. It was the winter of 1854 in the parish of Ghyllbeck, high in the Yorkshire Dales, an hour's cart ride above Skipton. The snow came sideways off the moor that year. It packed against the church wall and stayed. Prudence Thorne buried her father, the vicar, on a Tuesday, with the ground so hard the sexton had cut it in 2 days of work. She stood at the graveside in her mourning grey. The wind pulled at her hem. She did not weep where they could see her. That was not pride. It was only that she had wept already, alone, and had none left to spend in front of the parish. Her father had left her 3 things: a cottage, the glebe cottage beside the church, warm enough and dry, £40 of debts, gathered up over years of a poor living and a soft heart, and no income of any kind. The living passed to a new man, a curate from Leeds, who would want the vicarage in the spring. The cottage was hers. The rest was hers too, in a way. The debts were hers. She was 31. She was not married, and there was no man courting, and no likelihood of one. In a parish like Ghyllbeck, a woman of 31, with no husband and no money, was a settled fact. Like the weather. People did not wonder about her. They only wondered, quietly, how she would live. The war was in the newspaper. Her father had read it aloud to her through the autumn by the fire in the evenings before he took ill. The Crimea. Names she could not place on any map she owned. The Alma. Balaclava. Men she would never meet, dying in a cold worse than her own. To Prudence it had been a paragraph, and a low, sad voice reading it, and the click of her needles as she listened. She did not know yet that the war would reach up the beck and find her. She could not have known. Here is the thing you must understand about Prudence Thorne, because the rest of the story turns on it. She had not been raised only in the parsonage. Her mother had come from farming people, from up the beck, and her mother's brother was Reuben Ray. Reuben kept sheep on the high ground above Ghyllbeck, and every summer of her girlhood, when the parsonage was dull and the days were long, Prudence had been sent up to her uncle's farm. She had not been sent to sit and be a lady. She had worked. She had learned to dag a fleece, to clear the mucked wool from a sheep's hindquarters with a blade. She had learned the smell of a flock in the rain. She had learned to sort her uncle's clip when the shearing was done, to lay the fleeces out and grade them, coarse from fine, staple from noil. She had learned a comb from a card, which is not a thing most parsons' daughters know, and does not sound like much until the day it is everything. She told a neighbour once, plainly, without any weight on it, "Summers I sorted my uncle's clip for pin money. I never thought the knack worth naming." She said it the way you'd mention you could bake bread, or set a bone. A thing you knew, not a thing you thought would ever matter. Remember that she said it. Nobody in that kitchen remembered it. But you will need it. Now. There was a man in the Dale named Jonas Fenby. Fenby had tried to be a clothier. He had bought fleeces 2 seasons running, meaning to spin and weave and sell cloth, and he had failed at it the way soft men with small capital do fail. He was not a fool, and he was not a cheat. He had simply reached too far, and the money ran out before the cloth came good. Now he owed on every side, and the bailiffs had a date marked, and in his shed sat 2 seasons of fleeces he could not use. Those fleeces had been condemned. That is the word the trade used, and it is a hard word. They had been taken down to Skipton, some of them, and shown to the buyers, and the buyers had turned them over and turned them back and shaken their heads. Yellowed, they said. Felted, matted together in the grease, gone hard in the middle, unfit for combing, unfit for cloth. Spoilt, 300 fleeces, give or take, sitting in the dark, going by every account from bad to worthless. Fenby wanted £4 to be shot of the lot. Not £4 a fleece, £4 for all 300. It was less than the price of the shed door. He only wanted them gone before the men came to sell him up, so that at least that much would be his, and not the creditor's. Prudence heard of it the way you hear of everything in a small parish. A word at the well, a word after church. And where another woman in her place would have heard only Fenby's ruin, Prudence heard something else. She heard 300 fleeces, condemned, going for £4. And a small hard voice in her, the voice from the summers on her uncle's farm, said, "I should like to see them washed, before I believe them dead." She had £4, of course, nowhere in the world. She had £40 of debt and a cold cottage. What she had, wrapped in a roll of green baize on the shelf in the back room, was her mother's silver. 6 spoons, a ladle, a small teapot with a dented lid, and a pair of candlesticks that had come down from her mother's mother. A jeweller in Skipton, if pressed, would give near £11 for it. It was the last thing of her mother's she owned that had any price on it at all. It was the thing she had sworn, at the graveside, she would never let go. She sat with it a long time, the night she decided. She unrolled the baize on the kitchen table and laid the pieces out in the candlelight, and she looked at them, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about the summers on the farm, and she thought about 300 fleeces in the dark that nobody had troubled to wash. And in the morning she took the candlesticks down to Skipton and pledged them, not sold, pledged, against £4, and she came home with the money knotted in her handkerchief and a heavy place under her ribs where the silver used to be. You should feel the weight of that. It was not a clever woman playing at business. It was a frightened woman, newly orphaned, betting the last of her mother against a shed full of what everyone in the world she knew had called rubbish. If she was wrong, she had thrown her mother's silver after Jonas Fenby's ruin, and the parish would say so, and they would be right to. She went to Fenby with the £4. He met her at the shed with a lantern, ashamed and grateful all at once, a big, soft, ruined man in a coat too good for his circumstances now. He opened the door for her, and there they were. The smell hit her first, lanolin and damp, and something sour underneath, the smell of grease gone stale. The fleeces were piled to the height of a man, rolled and stacked, yellow in the lantern light. Some of them stuck to their neighbours, felted at the edges where the weight and the damp had pressed them together. Fenby watched her face for the flinch. Every buyer had flinched. Prudence did not flinch. She set the lantern on a barrel. She took up a fleece from the top, and she opened it out with her hands the way her uncle had taught her, from the breech, spreading it wide. She looked at the outside, yellow and hard. Then she pushed her fingers down into it, into the heart of the staple, close to where the wool had grown from the skin. And there, deep in, out of the weather and the light, the wool was not yellow. It was done. It was greasy and dirty, yes, but under the dirt it was sound. She said nothing to Fenby about it. She only nodded and counted, walking the shed with the lantern, touching each stack, moving her lips. 300 and a few over. She signed his paper by the light of the lantern. She gave him the £4. And she took the key of the shed, and she walked home in the dark, with it warm in her glove, and she did not tell a soul what she had felt in the heart of that fleece. But a purchase like that cannot stay quiet. She had to bring the wool down eventually, and before that she had to go to Skipton herself on market day to make arrangements for a cart and to speak, if she could, to a buyer about what such wool might fetch when it was cleaned. She was green enough still to think a buyer might listen. She learned better within the hour. The wool floor at Skipton on a market day is a loud place, and a close one, thick with the smell of grease and men and pipe smoke. The staplers stood at their tables, the farmers came in with their clips, and over it all, the chief buyer, the man whose word made or unmade a price in that dale, was Silas Garside. Garside was a broad man, well-fed, with a way of holding his chin down and looking up at you from under his brows, so that even when he was being pleasant, he seemed to be judging a fleece. He had bought and graded wool for 30 years. He knew, or believed he knew, everything a man could know about it. He knew staple length and crimp and grease yield. He knew the price of every grade in every market from Skipton to Bradford. What he did not know, though he would have laughed to be told it, was the customer. He knew the wool. He had never once in 30 years asked himself what a particular buyer, for a particular purpose, might actually want. He graded, and he mistook his grading for the whole of knowledge. Somebody had told him about the parson's girl and Fenby's condemned fleeces. Of course somebody had. And when Prudence came onto the floor in her morning grey, quiet, asking a civil question of a man at the near table about the price of cleaned Dale's wool, Garside saw his sport. He reached down into a bale beside him, one of Fenby's own, still there unsold, and he pulled out a fleece. A bad one. The worst kind, yellow and felted hard. He carried it out into the middle of the floor, and he held it up over his head into the grey light from the high windows so the whole floor could see it. The talk died down to hear him. "Here it is, gentlemen," Garside said, loud and easy, playing to them. "Fenby's ruin. Condemned at this very table by me, not a month gone, unfit for combing, unfit for cloth, rotten in the heart. He turned it in the light. And who has bought it? Who has laid down good money for spoilt wool that 30 of us here would not take as a gift?" He looked round, and he found her, standing near the door in her grey. He did not need to point. Every man followed his eyes. £4, Garside said. £4 for spoilt wool, and a parson's girl to be cheated of it, by a bankrupt, at a lantern in the dark. He let it hang. Then he delivered the line he had been building to, the line the whole floor was waiting for, and he smiled as he said it. "Buy her a spinning wheel, someone, and let her play." And 30 men laughed. You have to sit in that a moment, do not hurry past it. 30 men, in a loud close room, laughing at a woman in mourning who had buried her father that same winter and pledged her dead mother's silver on a gamble. She stood by the door, and the laughter went over her and around her, and she felt the heat come up her neck and into her face, and she felt the tears start, hot, behind her eyes. She did not let them fall. That is the thing to hold on to. She did not answer Garside. She did not defend herself. She had at that moment no ledger to point to, no order, no proof, nothing but a feeling in the heart of a fleece that she could not have made a single one of those men believe. So she did not try. She stood until the worst of the laughing had passed. Then she turned, and she went out to arrange her cart. And she came back later when Garside was busy, and she did what she had come to do quietly at the edge of the floor, and she went home. The verdict of the floor became the verdict of the parish, the way water runs downhill. By the end of the week, everyone in Ghyllbeck knew. The parson's girl had pledged her mother's silver, 11 pounds of good silver, and thrown 4 pounds of it after Jonas Fenby's rotten wool. A woman, unmarried, 31. No man to check her, no head for money, grief-mad, likely poor thing. They did not all say it unkindly. Some of them pitied her, which was worse. But the word had a shape now, and the shape was Fool, the 4-pound fool. She heard it. Of course she heard it, and here is where you learn what she was made of. She did not go down to the floor to argue. She did not write letters to the paper. She did not so much as raise her voice at the well. She went and got the shed key, and she started work. She had no money to hire men, and no men would have come cheap to handle condemned wool for a woman the whole Dale was laughing at. So she went to the workhouse at the edge of the parish, and she hired 2 women by the day. Mercy Dauber and Anne Skelton. Mercy was older, wide and slow and strong, with hands like a man's. Anne was young and sharp-faced and quick, with a tongue on her and a mind behind it. Prudence paid them 10p each a day, which was honest money for that work and that place, and she promised it steady as long as the work lasted. For 2 women from the workhouse, steady bread was the whole of the world. They came. And Prudence set out to prove, to nobody but herself, and 2 paupers, and God, that the wool was not dead. The way you clean a greasy fleece then, before there was any factory scouring worth the name up the Dale, was old and hard, and it stank. You washed it. You washed it in running water first, in the beck to carry off the loose dirt, and the beck below the shed ran brown for it. Then you steeped it in liquor to cut the grease. And the liquor was not sweet. It was stale urine, saved and gone sharp, mixed with soft soap. Wool washers had used it since before anyone could remember, because the ammonia in it cut the lanolin the way nothing else cheap would. It was foul work. It froze your hands in winter. The smell got into your clothes and your hair and would not leave. They set the tubs in the shed and by the beck. They worked fleece by fleece, and Prudence, with her sleeves pinned back and her mother's silver already gone and nothing left to lose, put her own hands in the tubs alongside the workhouse women, because she would not ask them to touch what she would not touch herself. The yellow lifted. That was the thing. The first fleece they steeped and rinsed and lifted out and wrung and spread. The ugly yellow that the whole trade had condemned, the yellow that Silas Garside had held up to the light as proof of ruin, that yellow ran off in the water. It was grease. It was dirt. It was 2 seasons of a bad shed and stale weather. It was not the wool. Under it, wrung and drying, the wool came out done and clean and sound, staple after staple, a whole fleece of it, sound to the heart. Mercy Dauber looked at it a long time. Anne Skelton, the sharp young one, looked at it, and then she looked at Prudence, and she asked the question that hangs over this whole story. She asked it plainly, wiping her hands. "If it comes clean like that," Anne said, "why did none of the buyers ever wash one?" Just the one. Just to look. Prudence stopped. Because there it was, out of the mouth of a workhouse girl who could not read, the exact question. Why had none of them washed one? Garside had held the fleece to the light. He had turned it over. He had judged it by its face, by the yellow and the felt on the outside, and he had condemned it, and 30 men had taken his word, and not one of them, in the whole trade, had thought to put one single fleece in a tub of water and see what came off. They had not needed to. They knew wool. They graded it every day. They were so certain of what their eyes told them that they never tested it. Because they were sure, Prudence said. That was all. They were sure, Anne. Being sure is the cheapest thing in the world. And she put her hands back in the tub. They washed on through the short days. And when the washing was done, and 300 fleeces hung and dried done and sound where they had come in yellow and condemned, Prudence began the second thing, the thing her uncle had taught her in the summers. She began to sort. Because the buyers had been half right, and it is important that you know that. She was not going to pretend the whole 300 were prime. They were not. 2 seasons in a bad shed had done real harm to some of it. The outer staple on many fleeces, the part most exposed, had weathered and gone weak. The middle, where the damp and the weight had pressed, had felted. Matted together, into a dense mass. And the heart, deep in, protected, was as good as any wool in the dale. So she sorted the whole 300 by hand into 3 grades. The ruined outer staple, weak and weathered, she pulled and put to one side, the coarsest grade, fit only for the roughest work. The felted middle, matted and dense, she put to another, and that was the odd one, the one to remember. And the sound heart, the good clean done wool, she put to the third, the best, the prime. She kept the count on the wall. On the boards of the shed she chalked her tally, grade by grade, fleece by fleece, 3 columns of marks growing day by day, so that anyone who walked in could see exactly what she had and where it stood. It became the thing people remembered about that shed, later the chalk tally on the wall. The parson's girl's reckoning, kept in the open, in her own hand. And once, standing back from the felted grade, the matted middle wool that the trade would have thrown out fastest of all, she said a thing that Mercy Dauber remembered and repeated afterward. She said it half to herself. The comb failed it, she said, looking at the matted grade. That's all that happened. It was combed, and it wouldn't comb, and they wrote it off. Nobody asked what else it might pass. Nobody asked what else it might pass. Hold that too. The whole story is inside it. Because here is what Prudence knew from the summers that Silas Garside had never troubled to think about. There is more than one way to use wool. You can comb it, which draws the fibres out long and straight and parallel, and spins them into worsted, into fine, smooth, strong cloth, and for that you need long sound staple, and felting is the enemy, felting is ruin. That was the trade Garside knew. That was the test he ran in his head when he held a fleece to the light. Would it comb? Fenby's wool would not comb, so it failed. So it was rotten. But you can also card wool, which tangles the fibres together short and crossed, and spins them soft and full, and you weave that into woolens, into blankets, into the thick warm cloth that a comb would never make. And for that, a wool that mats, a wool that felts readily, that wants to knit itself together, is not a fault at all. It is exactly, precisely, the thing you want. Fenby's felted middle grade, the matted wool that the whole floor had condemned fastest, the wool that had failed the comb worst of all, was wool that wanted to felt. It had told them so, in the shed, by felting, and they had read that as death. Prudence read it as a signature. She had no use for that reading yet. It was only knowledge, sitting in her, the way it had sat in her uselessly through all the summers when she thought the knack not worth naming. What turned the knowledge into a weapon was a folded page. It came to the shed by chance, or what looked like chance. Reuben Ray, her uncle, had come down from the high ground to see how his sister's girl did. Since he had heard the whole parish was laughing at her, and he did not care to hear his flesh and blood laughed at. He came into the shed and saw the tubs and the drying wool and the chalk tally on the wall, and he said very little, because he was that kind of man, but his face changed, and Prudence saw it change, and it was worth more to her than anything the parish could say. He knew what he was looking at. He was a farmer, and he assumed, the way farmers did, that no one would ever listen to a farmer. But he knew, and he had brought, folded in his coat to light his pipe with, a page of an old London Gazette that had been passed round the market, and on that page, among the notices, was an advertisement from the Board of Ordnance. The commissariat. The army. They were contracting for blankets, army blankets, in their thousands, for the men in the Crimea who were dying of the cold as much as of the guns. Prudence took the page from her uncle before he could tear it for a spill. She smoothed it out, and she read the specification, line by line. In the shed, in the failing light, with her dun wool drying around her and the chalk tally on the wall behind her, she read exactly what the Queen's army required in a blanket. It gave a weight. So many ounces to the yard, a heavy cloth, a warm cloth. It gave a size. It gave a breaking strain, a strength the cloth must hold, and it described the finish. The blankets were to be milled, fulled, felted, in plain words, the cloth beaten and shrunk and matted until it was dense and warm and would turn the weather. That was the finish the army wanted, a felted finish. Nowhere, in the whole specification, from top to bottom, was there one word about long staple, not one word about combing, not one word about worsted, about the smooth, straight, strong yarn that Silas Garside had held Fenby's wool to the light to test for, and found it wanting, and condemned it. The army did not want wool that combed. The army wanted wool that felted. Warm, dense, matted, milled, the army wanted, though it did not know Jonas Fenby's name and never would, exactly the wool that was drying dun and sound in Prudence Thorne's shed, sorted into 3 grades under a chalk tally, condemned by the whole dale as rotten. She read it twice. Then she took a lock of the felted middle grade, the worst condemned of all, and she rolled it between her finger and thumb. And she felt it do the thing. She felt it start to felt, right there, warm and willing, matting under the pressure of her hand the way the trade said meant ruin. She had felt it 100 times. She had never once, until that page, felt it mean money. And meanwhile, down in Skipton and out across the county, Ezra Crowther and 2 other large clothiers had seen the very same advertisement in the very same Gazette. And they were preparing their bids. They were men of the trade, established, moneyed, sure, and they read the contract the way men like that read everything. They read it by grade name. They saw army blankets, thousands of them, and they thought, that is a woolen's contract, we will use middling wool, and they turned to their books and their usual suppliers and their usual prices. And they made ready to bid on the strength of what they always did. Not one of them read the specification the way Prudence read it, line by line, weight and strain and finish, and asked what the wool must actually do. They knew the trade. They did not read the page. They skimmed it, and they bid on the grade names, and they went home to their suppers, certain of themselves. Prudence took the page home. She did not tell anyone what she had seen in it. She folded it small, and she put it in her apron pocket, and she kept it there, and she would keep it there for weeks to come, a folded page against her hip, the whole secret of the thing, waiting. Her uncle came again a few days later, and this time she asked him, because she wanted to hear it from a man who had done it, and not just from the summers in her memory. She asked him plainly, "A blanket, uncle, what wool makes a blanket?" And Reuben Ray, who thought no one would ever listen to a farmer, sat by her fire and told his sister's girl exactly what she already knew and needed to hear anyway. "A blanket is not worsted," he said. "You don't want it long, and you don't want it straight. You want it to mat. You want it to knit up warm and full, and turn the cold. Felting's no fault in a blanket, girl. Felting's the whole point of it." And there it was, said aloud, by a man who kept sheep and knew. The whole secret, in the open, in her own kitchen. The wool the Dale had condemned for felting was wool that would make exactly the blanket the army was begging for. The comb had failed it. The Queen's specification would pass it. Every man who had laughed on that floor had been measuring it against the wrong test, their own test, the test they always ran, and calling it dead when all it had done was fail a question nobody had thought to stop asking. You, watching now, hold the whole of it. You know what Prudence knew. You know what Reuben confirmed. You know what was on that folded page. And out in the parish, at that same moment, they still called her the 4-pound fool. Silas Garside still told the story of the parson's girl and the spinning wheel to any man on the floor who had not heard it. Ezra Crowther still bent over his books, bidding on grade names, certain he knew what the army wanted. Not one of them knew what you know. That is the cruel sweetness of this kind of story. The truth is already whole. It is finished, sitting in a shed under a chalk tally, folded in an apron pocket. It only wants one thing. It wants a test that Prudence herself cannot set, and cannot rig and cannot beg. It wants a verdict from someone above all of them, someone who does not care that she is a woman, or 31, or unmarried, or the talk of the parish, someone who will read the same specification and put her wool to it and say, in writing, sound or not sound. And so Prudence Thorne did the only thing left that she could do. She did not go back to the Skipton floor to argue. She never argued. She took her prime grade and she carded a quantity of it, and she spun a trial length, working late by the fire with the wheel the parish had joked she should be bought. She had a length woven, and milled to the weight the specification named, felted and fulled until it was dense and warm and would turn the weather. She cut a square of it. She sealed it. She wrote out her 3-grade tickets in her own plain hand, the same reckoning as the chalk on the wall. And she wrote a covering letter with no boast in it and no scheme in it, a letter that said, in effect, only this: here is a sample. It meets the specification you advertised. I can supply the wool. She folded the letter around the sealed sample and the grade tickets. She addressed it to the commissariat, to the Board of Ordnance, in London. And on a grey morning, with the rent coming due and her mother's silver still lying pledged in a Skipton drawer, and the whole parish still laughing behind her back, she carried it down to be posted, and she let it go. No boast, no scheme. She simply sent London the thing the page had asked for, and said nothing to anyone, and came home to wait. The letter went south on the mail, and in an office she had never seen, a man she had never met would open it. His name was Hollis, an inspector for the board, a careful man with a written test and no interest at all in reputations. He would take her sealed square in his hands, and he would weigh it and pull it and read her grade tickets and set it against the specification and make his mark in a docket. But that had not happened yet. That morning, all Prudence Thorne knew was that the silver was gone, the rent was due, the parish was laughing, and everything she had, everything, now rode on a folded page in a mailbag, and on whether a stranger in London would read it the way she had, or the way Silas Garside had held a fleece to the light and laughed. She walked home up the beck in the cold. And she waited. The waiting was the hardest work she had ever done. Harder than the beck. Harder than the tubs. There was nothing to do with her hands now, and that was the cruelty of it. The wool was scoured, the wool was graded. The chalk tally stood on the shed wall in 3 neat columns, 300 and a few over, every fleece counted twice. The sample was gone south on the mail, and Prudence Thorne sat in the cold cottage with her father's empty chair across from her, and she had nothing left to do but wait for a stranger in London to make his mark. The days went slow. Frost on the inside of the glass in the mornings, the rent falling due, and no way to pay it but to wait. Her mother's silver still lying in a drawer in Skipton, 6 spoons, a ladle, a small teapot with a dented lid, and a pair of candlesticks, pledged against £4 she had already spent. She would count them in her head at night. 6 spoons. A ladle, the teapot, the candlesticks, as if counting them kept them hers. Mercy Dauber came up the beck one morning, wanting to know was there more work. There was not. Not yet. Prudence paid her the 10p owing from the last day and had nothing more to offer, and Mercy took it without complaint and went back down to the workhouse. Anne Skelton did not come at all. There was no work, and both women knew it, and Prudence knew they knew it, and she stood in the door of the shed and looked at 300 sound fleeces that not one soul in the dale would buy, and for the first time she let herself wonder if she had been the fool the whole parish said she was. Then word came down from Skipton that made it worse. Ezra Crowther had heard. Of course he had heard. A thing like this could not stay quiet in a dale where 30 men had laughed. The parson's girl had sent London a sample. That was the joke now on the wool floor, and Crowther was the one telling it. He was a large man with a large voice, and he told it well. "She's sent the army her spoilt wool," he said, standing where Garside had stood, holding court over the same trading floor, dressed it up in a bit of ribbon and posted it to the Queen, as if the Board of Ordnance buys condemned goods off a churchyard, as if they can't tell rot from cloth in London any better than we can in Skipton. He laughed, and the men around him laughed, because it was Crowther, and because it was easy. And this was the part Prudence did not see, and could not have borne if she had. Because Crowther had a bid of his own going in on that same contract. He and 2 others, all 3 of them large men with counting houses and clerks, all 3 of them bidding on the army blankets. And every one of the 3 had done the thing that clever men do when they are sure of themselves. They had read the grade names in the advertisement, and they had bid the grades they knew. The long-combed staple, the smooth worsted, the Wooler stapler holds to the light and approves, and not one of the 3 had read the specification through. Not one of them had gone down the printed lines to the words that mattered. Weight per yard. Breaking strain. The felted finish required. Nothing about long straight staple at all. They bid what they knew. Prudence had bid what the page asked for, but she did not know that yet, sitting in her cold cottage. All she knew was that the parish was still laughing, and Crowther louder than any, and the sample was 3 weeks gone, with no word. In London, in an office she would never see, a careful man named Hollis had her sealed square in his hands. He was an inspector for the Board of Ordnance, and he had no interest in reputations, and none at all in a dale he had never heard of. He had a written test in front of him and a sample to try against it, and that was the whole of his concern. He weighed the square on a small brass scale. He wrote a figure. He took the cloth in both hands and pulled it against itself, hard, watching the weave hold. He wrote a figure. He read her 3 grade tickets in her plain hand, and he set them against his own reckoning, and where a lesser man might have looked for the trick in it, Hollis only looked for the truth of it, because that was his trade. And then he did a thing Prudence could not have known he did. He opened a docket, and he began to write, slow, careful, grade by grade, and what he wrote no one in Ghyllbeck could yet read. The order came on a Thursday. It came the way large things come to small places, which is to say it came quietly, and then all at once. The churchwarden had it first, because the board had written to the parish, not knowing where else a woman with no counting house might be found, and the churchwarden, who was not a cruel man but not a quick one either, read it twice to be sure, and then he sent word round that it would be read out in the vestry after the morning service, this letter that had come from London under a seal. They filled the vestry. Of course they did. Half of them came to hear a jokeland, the parson's girl, and her 4 pounds of rot, and now London had written back, and they meant to be there when the laugh came home. Prudence stood at the back in her mourning grey. She had heard the word passing up the beck, and she had come down, and she stood where she always stood now, apart, with her hand resting on the top rail of the last pew. She did not push forward. She did not speak. She only stood and waited, the same as she had waited 3 weeks in the cottage, and her face gave nothing. The churchwarden cleared his throat and read. He read the direction first, the Board of Ordnance, the commissariat, the seal. He read her name, Prudence Thorne of the parish of Ghyllbeck, and a few of the men near the front turned to grin at each other, because here it came. And then he read the body of the thing, and the grins went slowly off their faces, one and then another. The way frost goes off a window when the sun finds it. The sample submitted by Prudence Thorne, the letter said, had been tested against the specification. It met the specification in every particular: weight, strain, the felted finish, every particular. And the commissariat, being satisfied, did hereby order of Prudence Thorne 2,000 army blankets, milled to the weight and finish of the sample supplied, at 6 shillings and 6pence the blanket, the whole to be delivered within 84 days. 2,000 blankets. 6 and 6 apiece. The churchwarden's voice slowed as the sum built itself in his head, and in every head in the room, because it was not a sum that fit in the dale, it was a sum with hundreds in it. And it had been made out of 4 pounds of wool that 30 men had laughed at, in a shed that a bankrupt could not give away. There was no laughing now. The vestry was very quiet. Somewhere a bench creaked, and every neighbour who had called her a fool turned, one after another, to look to the back of the room, where a woman in grey stood with her hand on a pew rail. Prudence Thorne said nothing. Her hand did not move on the rail. She let them look. She had waited 3 weeks in the cold for this letter, and she had waited a long winter before that, and she found now that she did not need to say a single word. The letter had said all of it. She met their eyes, the ones brave enough to hold hers, and she let the reading stand on its own. Because a woman who has read a page correctly does not need to raise her voice about it. But there was one thing she would say, and she said it plainly, into the quiet, so that all of them heard it, and none of them could pretend after that they had not. "It failed your comb," she said. "It never failed the Queen's specification. You did not reject the wool, gentlemen, you rejected the reading of it." Then she let go of the rail, and she went out, up the beck, home. The news went to Skipton the same day it went to Crowther's counting-house, and both of them by nightfall, and neither of them was ready for it. Crowther heard it from a clerk. His own bid, the safe-grade name bid, the worsted, the long-combed staple, had been set aside. Not even weighed against hers, some said. Set aside because it did not answer the specification, and hers did. He read the notice through twice, the way the churchwarden had, and where the churchwarden had grown slow with wonder, Crowther grew still with something colder, because Crowther could count, and Crowther could see what he had done. He had held the whole trade in his hand, and he had never once turned the page over to read the far side. But the true reckoning, the one that mattered, came a fortnight after, when Mr. Hollis himself came north to inspect the first bales. He came to the Skipton floor because that was where wool was weighed and graded in that country, and he wanted the stock seen and certified before a loom in the dale touched it. And so the strangest gathering the wool floor had seen in years came together under that high, cold roof. The inspector from London, with his docket and his brass scale. The first bales of Ghyllbeck wool scoured and sorted and carted down. And the staplers, the buyers, the whole floor, Silas Garside among them, the chief of them, the man who had held a fleece to the light and called for a spinning wheel and a laugh. Hollis worked the way careful men work, which is to say, he did not hurry and he did not care who watched. He opened the bales. He took the wool grade by grade, the coarsest, the felted middle, the sound heart, and he weighed each, and he pulled each, and he read Prudence's grade tickets, the same reckoning she had chalked on the shed wall through the winter, 3 columns, 3 grades, and he checked her tickets against his own hands, and grade for grade he confirmed them. Every ticket she had written, every column she had chalked. The wool was what she said it was, sound where she said it was sound, felted where the blanket wanted it felted. The docket he had opened in London he now closed in Skipton, and it said in an inspector's plain writing, over the board's authority, that Prudence Thorne's grading was correct in every particular. And Silas Garside had to stand and hear it. He had to stand on his own floor, the floor that deferred to him, and hear a man above him, a man from the board itself, certify sound the very fleeces he had held up to be laughed at. He had graded that wool with his own eye and his own habit, and pronounced it spoilt before 30 men. And now the Queen's own inspector laid it out grade by grade and found it good. There is no colder place for a proud man than to be corrected by someone he cannot answer, in front of the very men he taught to defer to him. Hollis finished his docket, he set down his pen, and he said to no one in particular, in the flat way of a man stating a fact, well graded. Whoever sorted this knew the fleece. The floor was silent, and Garside, chief stapler at Skipton, took his cap off his head. He was not a young man, and he was not, when it came to it, a stupid one, and he knew when a thing was finished. He turned his cap in his hands, and he said, the only true thing left to say. "We knew the wool," he said. "We never asked the customer. Nobody laughed. Nobody had anything to add. 30 men had laughed on that floor in the winter, and not one of them found a word now." After that, the Dale turned around all at once, the way a flock turns. The shed that Jonas Fenby could not give away, the shed of 300 condemned fleeces, was suddenly the only stock in the whole county that fitted the contract. Every loom for miles wanted Ghyllbeck wool, because Ghyllbeck wool was the wool the army would take, and no other wool in the Dale had been scoured and graded to answer the specification. £4 it had cost, in the winter. Now it could not be reckoned in pounds at all. Now it was the thing every clothier in the county needed, and could not get, except through the woman in the glebe cottage up the beck. And Ezra Crowther, who had bid-grade names and lost, came to the cottage door. He came in his good coat, with notes in his hand. He stood on the step where the frost had been, and he was civil now, very civil, because civility was cheaper than wool. He had thought it through, he said. A contract of that size was a great deal of work for a woman on her own. The milling, the carting, the delivery inside, 84 days. He was willing to take it off her hands. He would buy the shed and all its stock and the contract with it, and pay her fairly for the trouble she'd been to. £30, he said, and let the figure sit, as if £30 were a fortune to a parson's girl, which, a season ago, it would have been. Prudence stood in the doorway. She had the folded page of the London Gazette in her apron pocket, the same page she had read line by line in the cold shed, and she kept her hand near it, the way another woman might keep her hand near a purse. Behind her, on the mantel, she had that morning set back in its place the baize roll of her mother's silver, redeemed from the Skipton drawer the day the board's first payment cleared. 6 spoons. A ladle. The teapot with the dented lid. The candlesticks. Home again, where they belonged. £30, she said. 30, said Crowther, and no man in the Dale to say you didn't come off well. No, she said. He raised it. Of course he raised it. He named a larger figure, the way a man does who thinks the first was only a door to knock on. And Prudence Thorne shook her head at the larger figure the same as she had shaken it at the first, because it was not the figure she was refusing. You don't want the wool, Mr. Crowther, she said. You want the reading of it. You want to buy the thing you couldn't do yourself. And that's the one thing in that shed that isn't for sale. She was not unkind about it. She did not need to be. I'll sell you finished blankets if you've a loom idle and want the work. I'll sell any man in the Dale honest cloth at an honest price. But I'll grade my own wool, and I'll write my own tickets, and the women who wash it will be on wages by the week, not by the day and hoping. That's my terms. There's no other. Crowther stood a moment on the step with his notes in his hand and nowhere to put them. Then he put them away, and he went, and she closed the door. They came, after that, one at a time, the men who had condemned her, and she faced each one as he came, and gave each one what he was owed and no more. Word arrived from Garside first. It came sideways, as such things do, through a man who knew a man. The chief stapler let it be known that he would be glad to advise. On grades, you understand, on the sorting. A woman new to the trade, with 2,000 blankets to deliver and 84 days to do it in, would surely be glad of an experienced eye on the wool. He would come up, if she liked, and cast an eye over her grading. Prudence sent her thanks. She was grateful, she said, truly, but her grading was already done, and the board's own inspector had certified it, and she thought she would carry on as she had begun. She declined him the way you decline a second helping, warmly and completely, and Garside understood the warmth of it exactly, and did not offer again. Then there was Jonas Fenby, And Fenby was a different matter, because Fenby had not laughed. Fenby had only been a desperate man with a shed full of debt and no way out of it, and he had sold her the 300 for £4, because £4 was more than nothing and he needed to be shot of them. He had dealt with her honestly when he was down. He had not mocked her, and he had not cheated her, and he had shown her the shed and given her the key without a word against the wool. So Prudence, who forgot nothing, did a thing that surprised the Dale nearly as much as the order had. She sent for Fenby, and she paid him more. She paid him a fair overprice on the wool he had already sold her, unasked, money he had no claim to in law, and every claim to in the reckoning she kept. Because he had been honest when it cost him, she said, and she had done well out of his honesty, and she saw no reason a man should be poorer for having dealt straight with her when he was low. Fenby, who had expected nothing from anyone ever again, took it and could not speak, and went away a solvent man. And Reuben Ray, her uncle, the Dale's farmer up on the high ground, who had taught her as a girl to dag a fleece and know a comb from a card, who had told her plainly when she asked that a blanket is not worsted, and felting is a virtue and not a fault. Reuben, who had always assumed no one would ever listen to a farmer. Prudence named him. That was the whole of the gift, and it was everything. When the parish spoke of the parson's girl and her miracle of wool, she corrected them, every time, and told them where the knowing had come from. Not from London, not from a lucky page, from summers on her uncle's farm, sorting his clip for pin money, learning the feel of a fleece from a man who had handled 10,000 of them. She said it in the vestry, and she said it on the beck, and she said it to anyone who would call her clever, that Reuben Ray had known it all his life, and the only new thing she had done was read a printed page with what he had taught her. And the county's looms turned to Ghyllbeck wool, every one of them. The clothiers who had skimmed the specification and lost the bid still had looms to feed, and the only wool that answered was hers, and so the cloth of the whole county, that winter and the winters after, came off her grading. Every blanket in the county, near enough, began in a shed above the beck that a bankrupt could not give away, and passed under a chalk tally in a woman's plain hand. 6 months on, the beck ran clean and cold through a green summer. The cottage was kept, the rent was paid a year forward, and the debts her father left, the £40 of them, were gone, cleared to the last shilling. On the mantel the baize roll sat where it had always sat, and the silver inside it was her mother's again, and no one's pledge. 6 spoons. A ladle. The teapot with the dented lid. The candlesticks. She lit them of an evening now, and did not count them. Down at the shed the water ran milky with scoured wool, all through the warm months, the grease and the dirt lifting off in the beck the way it had that first bitter winter, and the fleeces coming out done and sound. Mercy Dauber and Anne Skelton sorted under the chalk tallies, on wages by the week now, steady bread at last, the first 2 souls in the Dale who had seen the wool come clean, and known before anyone that it was good. They were not day women hoping now. They had places, and they kept them. And the men who had laughed? Silas Garside never held another fleece to the light for a laugh. He graded on, careful and quiet, to the end of his days, and if a woman brought wool to his floor he weighed it the same as any man's, and said nothing about spinning wheels. And Ezra Crowther bid the next army contract the way he had bid the last, on the grade names he knew, sure of himself, reading the trade, and never the page. And he lost that one too. Prudence Thorne kept her grading in her own hands, and her women on wages, and her uncle's name on her lips, and she asked nothing of the parish that had laughed at her, but that it buy honest cloth at an honest price, which in the end it did, gladly, and by the cartload. She had learned one thing in a dead man's shed by candlelight, and she never forgot it, and it is the only moral this story has. Nothing is worthless. It has only failed a test that somebody else chose. Turn the page over, read the far side, feel for the thing the whole room forgot to test. The wool the comb rejected clothed an army because one woman weighed it against the right specification instead of the wrong habit. If you've ever seen worth in a thing the whole room called rubbish, then you already know how Prudence Thorne felt, standing at the back of that vestry with her hand steady on the rail. Tell me, in the comments, the name of your town and whether there's a Prudence Thorne in it. There nearly always is. Most of the Dale just hasn't read the far side of the page yet. The beck itself seemed different that summer. The Scour water ran cold and brown from the tubs Mercy set in the shallows each morning, and the smell of soft soap and lanolin hung in the air above the water from first light to last, and the sheep on Reuben's hill pasture above sometimes lifted their heads at it, as though they recognized something familiar in the air coming down the dale. Prudence would stand at the shed door at noon with a cup of tea and watch the water carry the grease out toward the lower fields, and she thought sometimes of Jonas Fenby watching the same beck from the road the winter before, seeing nothing in his shed worth keeping, and she did not blame him. He had been desperate, and desperation reads everything through its own lens. She had paid him £8 over his 4, unasked, and he had taken it without ceremony, which was the right way to receive a fair thing. Reuben came down from the hill every Thursday and walked the shed with her and said very little. He had a farmer's way of satisfaction, which is not to congratulate, but to simply not complain, and she knew him well enough to read it. He checked her chalk tallies against the bales, ran his thumb along the fleece ends she had sorted, and nodded, which was the whole of his praise, and was enough. Once, in August, when the last of the commissariat bales had gone out on the carrier's cart, and the shed held only the new clip from 3 farms she had contracted, he stood in the doorway a long time, looking at the chalk marks on the wall, the rows and columns she had kept since March, and he said, "I taught you to sort for pin money." And she said, "You taught me what I needed." And that was the end of the conversation, and they had their tea, and he walked back up the hill before dark. The silver sat in its baize roll on the mantel. She had not put it away in the drawer. She let it stay where she could see it. Not as a trophy, she was not given to trophies, but as a kind of honest accounting. She had pledged it against £4 and got it back, and between the pledging and the redeeming everything had changed, and she thought it right that the thing that had stood surety for all of it should sit in plain sight where the light caught it in the mornings. Some debts, she thought, you do not pay off, you simply keep them in view.